one of the co-founders of Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, for short, BOTPR. And, you know, BOTPR is really a network of Puerto Ricans across the U.S. that are not afraid to talk about U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico, and of course today about colonialism in Palestine. We advocate in Congress and elsewhere, like today. We create content and publish about the problems Puerto Ricans face because of the effects of U.S. colonial policies. This for me is a dream come true. This is a subject, Puerto Rican independence and anti-colonization, that has absorbed me long before I joined BOTPR, long before I went to law school, even before attending Georgetown University, that today I found out that I share the same university as Margaret, which is an honor. And this absorption, this obsession that I have, and my colleagues and my friends here that are going to be speakers, and Angel that's going to be the moderator, is Puerto Rico's liberation. That's our subject that passionates us. So today, we want to delve a little bit deeper into these two distinct but connected anti-colonial struggles, and in a way explore new ways of building solidarity by drawing inspiration from the past. Right? Margaret is going to talk about the history and the struggles of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. Sara is going to bring us a little bit more towards the present of Palestine. Of course, we have Daniela, our first Puerto Rican Alderwoman in St. Louis. Talking about how we can build a solidarity movement together. I'm going to quickly read their bios so we really know who's going to be talking to us. A few more minutes here. Margaret Power is a professor of history emeritus at the Illinois Institute of Technology. She's the author or co-author of 7 books, including Solidarity Across the Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, and Anti-Imperialism. That book is available for folks that we're asking for a suggested donation. It's up in the front. We have several copies. Feel free to grab one and come and see me to finish that transaction if interested. She has also written Right-Wing Women in Chile, Feminine Power and the Struggle Against Allende, and Transnational Communism Across the Americas. She is president of the board of directors of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center in Chicago, Illinois, and co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy. Next to her is Professor Sara Awartani. Sara is a collegiate fellow and assistant professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her first book project, Solidarities of Liberation, Visions of Empire, Puerto Rico, Palestine, and American Global Power, under advanced contract with the University of North Carolina Press, chronicles a globally expansive story of Palestine liberation, Puerto Rican radicalism, and the United States' efforts to weaponize and police those freedom dreams. Down the line, we have Daniela, as I mentioned, our alderwoman here for Ward 6. Daniela is proud to be the alderwoman for the 6th Ward, which represents the neighborhoods of Compton Heights, Compton Hill, Shaw, Tower Grove South, and portions of Dodgetown. Daniela is a first-generation St. Louisian. Her parents were both born in Puerto Rico and moved to the St. Louis region to build a better life. Daniela is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism and has served on boards of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan St. Louis, Pro-Choice Missouri, and St. Louis Public Radio. She is also a member of RBC's Leadership 100. Last but not least, our good comrade and friend, Angel Flores Fontanes. He's an IFCLA and BOTPR member. I have to say that he, along his IFCLA team here in St. Louis and with St. Louis University, made this possible, so my deepest thanks for this great team. Angel, fellow Puerto Rican, just like Daniela, and Sara, right? And I will also say Margaret as an honorary Puerto Rican. So we're all Puerto Ricans here. He was born in Caguas, where he encountered the effects of colonialism firsthand. In May of 2021, he completed his MA in U.S. History and his graduate minor in Women's and Gender Studies at this institution as a SLU with his thesis titled, "They Fear No Man, the Desegregation of St. Louis University." Now, he's completing a PhD in U.S. history, also at SLU, specializing in U.S. imperial history and Puerto Rico. His human rights work has led him to El Paso, Texas, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras. In St. Louis, he coordinates the education program for IFCLA and is an organizer of the anti-detention group Migrantes Unidos. Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the panel. Angel, please come up, and I'm going to sit down and enjoy the show. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Luis. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here once again. My name is Angel, member of IFCLA, about PR as well. We came up with this event for a very simple idea. Just as our oppression as colonized peoples unites us, our liberation also unites us. We cannot reach anyone's freedom without the freedom of the other, and that's why we wanted to make this event with you. Thank you so much for being here and just giving yourself a chance to have a dialogue about this subject, very relevant for today. This is the order that we will follow today. First of all, we will have a first round of introductions in which each panelist for 10 minutes will introduce their subject. And then we will follow that by a moderated session of questions that we have prepared based on the subject. And then we will have a 30-minute session of questions from the audience, so you can also ask your questions. All right, let us then begin. And I would like to ask our first panelist, Margaret, to please join us in the podium. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much for both of those great introductions, and I'm really happy to be here. My presentation is called Why International Solidarity Matters, and to talk about it, which is, of course, totally relevant for today, I'm actually going to go back into the past a bit and talk about Puerto Rico. What should I do this? I hang it.
Yeah, just as a distance.
Which, is it too close or too far?
Too close. Here,
Where, yeah, I know, it keeps getting those P things.
Like this, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
That's okay.
That should be.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We are gathering at a time when people around the world are protesting and denouncing the ongoing Israeli and U.S.-backed and financed war of genocide against Palestinians. We are witnessing and participating in a moment of unprecedented global solidarity with the Palestinian people. Puerto Ricans from the archipelago and throughout the diaspora have joined millions of people to demand freedom for Palestine and the Palestinian people, and to also decry and condemn this immeasurably cruel war, which is nothing more than Israel's attempt to eliminate the Palestinian people, a 2024 version of a final solution. Activists have also denounced the U.S. government's continued responsibility for and backing of the war. The ties of solidarity run deep between Palestinians and Puerto Ricans. I'm from Chicago, so every year, for example, the community in Puerto Rican community in Chicago is easily the best organized community outside of Puerto Rico. And every year they have a Puerto Rican Day parade, and Palestinians from the community and from surrounding area come and carry Palestinian flags in the parade, and they're always welcomed with lots of support. Communiques from the FALN, I'm not sure if you're talking about this or not, but from the Armed Forces of National Liberation, which was an armed clandestine organization operating in the United States, that carried out basically armed propaganda to call attention to the fact that Puerto Rico was and is a colony, would always end many of their communiques with call for a free Palestine. In a time of possible despair and cynicism, and of course there's plenty of reason for both, I will talk about why international solidarity matters and how we, joining with many others, can, have, and will make a difference. In 1898, the United States invaded Puerto Rico along with Cuba and the Philippines, promising all three colonies freedom and independence. Today, 126 years later, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States. In 1922, over 100 years ago, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party formed to achieve the establishment of a sovereign republic. One of their priorities was strengthening of international solidarity with the rest of Latin America. They understood that in order to secure independence, to go up against what was then becoming the strongest, mightiest empire of the world, Puerto Rico needed the support of people throughout the Americas. Their appeal was twofold. First, the nationalists pointed out that Puerto Rico had the right to be an independent nation and rejoin their sister republics throughout the Americas, with which they shared a language, a history, a culture. Second, the Nationalist Party pointed out that U.S. domination of Puerto Rico was key to United States imperial expansion throughout the hemisphere. Puerto Rico straddles the Mona Passage, which is the prime passage in and out of the Caribbean, which means that, say, U.S. ships, and in the early part of the 20th century, Navy was the key form of military conquest, could go in and out of Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico only gained in importance once the Panama Canal was opened in 1904, which was then for the United States the gateway to Asia. Puerto Rican nationalists, today often we think of nationalism as a bad thing. We know why. But Puerto Rican nationalists were simultaneously nationalists and anti-imperialists. They combined their goal of an independent Puerto Rico with heartfelt opposition to U.S. control of other Latin American countries and of European colonialism around the world. From 1927 to 1930, Pedro Albizu Campos, then vice president of the Nationalist Party, traveled to the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, Peru, Venezuela, to build ties of solidarity with people throughout the Latin America, with Latin America to support independence for archipelago. And now archipelago has become the term that many people use to refer to Puerto Rico. Albizu Campos was the first person to use that term way back in the 1920s. And they built committees of solidarity with Puerto Rican independence in places like Cuba. And I just want to say Cuba from the get-go has always had the strongest degree and amount of solidarity with Puerto Rico. And the committee they started in the 1970s persisted and continued, different names, different people, but up through the 1950s. Jumping ahead to the 1940s and 1950s, solidarity work also developed in the United States, principally in New York City, where the largest communities of Puerto Ricans lived and which was the center of the U.S. left. U.S. activists, interestingly, most of them pacifists, formed a close relationship with the Nationalist Party, which was not a pacifist party, and created the first U.S.-based solidarity committee with Puerto Rico. This is in the 1940s and 1950s. Americans for Puerto Rican Independence. Albizu Campos, who was then president of the Nationalist Party, was convalescing in New York City after being imprisoned for 6 very difficult months in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The relationship was so close that Thelma Milke, a North American woman who was a member of the Solidarity Committee, was named as a representative of the Nationalist Party to the United Nations. I'm going to give one concrete example of how these years of building solidarity mattered. In 1950, the Nationalist Party launched what was an unsuccessful uprising in Puerto Rico, and the goal of the uprising was to call attention to the fact that the United States was maneuvering along with Puerto Rican actors to transform Puerto Rico from an outright colony into what it is today, a neo-colony or disguised or a camouflage colony, the Free Associated State. So the Nationalist Party staged an uprising in Puerto Rico. Two members of the New York City branch of the Nationalist Party, Griselio Torresola and Oscar Collazo, were angered that the news media in the United States was portraying this as a civil war between Puerto Ricans. So they traveled to Washington, D.C. and attempted to assassinate President Truman. They were unsuccessful. One, Griselio, was killed. Oscar Collazo was given the death penalty. Immediately, family members, Solidarity committees sprang into action, and they began to mobilize solidarity throughout the Americas. And I want to keep in mind, this is somebody who was convicted of attempting to assassinate the President of the United States. He was given the death penalty. There was so much solidarity. And one other thing, this was at the height of the Cold War, which meant that anybody who was a foreigner, i.e. not a white U.S. American type, was viewed as suspicious, as dangerous. Puerto Ricans certainly fell into that category, even though they were U.S. citizens. And public sentiment ran very high for Oscar Collazo's execution. The efforts throughout the Americas were so successful. The Congresses of Guatemala, how could I forget? I have to look at my notes. Guatemala, Uruguay, and Argentina all passed resolutions demanding a stay of execution. Countless student organizations throughout the Americas wrote letters saying, "Do not execute Oscar Collazo." Dean Acheson, who was then Secretary of State, actually wrote a letter then, or communicated, and when I just seen the memo, to Truman saying, "I think it'd be better in terms of our relationship with Latin America if we didn't kill Oscar Collazo." And I think it's hard to understand exactly how powerful that was, that somebody who was tried to kill the President of the United States was not executed. And this was at a time when I say the Rosenbergs were on death row, and there was global support for to stay the execution of the Rosenbergs, but they were murdered, as I think we know. Solidarity with Puerto Rico has never been a one-way street. In the 1980s, the United States was supplying the government of El Salvador with millions of dollars in military supplies and training to combat the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, which was a guerrilla organization in El Salvador fighting to end military rule and bring democracy and social justice to El Salvador. In 1981, the Macheteros, a clandestine group in Puerto Rico, blew up 13 National Guard planes right near San Juan, which were bound for El Salvador to carry out bombing attacks against the civilian population. This was a very concrete act of solidarity in which nobody was killed, in fact, in which many people's lives were spared as a result of that. The Macheteros, why? Because the Macheteros called in a warning to evacuate the area. This was a real warning, not the fake warnings that Israel claims it is sending to try and preserve its image as a decent state. People were evacuated, and they had a place to go. The planes had been bound for El Salvador. 15 or so years later, the campaign, in 1981, 11 of the members of the FALN, the clandestine group, were arrested in Chicago. 15 years later, the campaign was really gaining a lot of strength. So they were released, the FALN, due to a similar national and international campaign. I'm going to give one example, which I was part of. That's how I kind of know it. I wrote to elected members of the FMLN who were part of the Salvadorian Congress at the time. I asked them to write letters to President Clinton asking him to release the FALN prisoners. They did so enthusiastically, and they in fact said, "We're grateful for you because you're giving us the opportunity to thank Puerto Rico, to thank Puerto Ricans for the tremendous act of international solidarity that you carried out." International solidarity is simultaneously an emotional, intellectual, political, and moral response. I have no doubt that all of us are horrified, saddened, and outraged at the IDF's massive destruction of Palestinian homes, mosques, other places of worship, cultural institutions, just as we are infuriated at Israel's deliberate starving of people in Gaza, particularly the children and babies, and its deliberate denial of essential medical supplies, food, and fuel to these people. Solidarity, our heartfelt identification with other peoples, allows us to transcend the artificial and often oppressive national boundaries that imperialism creates, and to fully recognize our essential oneness with people all over the world. But it also allows us to join with others who share our political, intellectual, and moral vision for a better world, and strengthens both our commitment and our ability to achieve our goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powers, for that introduction to the colonial reality of Puerto Rico and the historical solidarity of its combatants with Latin America and elsewhere. Please give it up for our second panelist, Dr. Awartani. About this height is good.
Where can I put this?
You can put it in your necklace, or you can hold it in your hand, however it works.
Does that work? Can everybody hear me?
A little louder.
Beautiful. A little louder? You got to shout? Is that good? Wonderful. All right, so it is a delight and an honor to be in community with you all today. I'd like to do something a little different with my opening remarks this evening, and hopefully in the Q&A period, I can return to some of the rich stories that emerge from the archive of Puerto Rican Solidarities with Palestine. But to begin our time together, I'd like to address why we can and why we should compare Puerto Rico and Palestine. So as many of us gathered together this evening likely know, since October 7th, we've really seen an unprecedented number of Puerto Ricans, largely in the archipelago, but also among those of us in the diaspora, who have taken to the streets to organize and march in solidarity with Palestine. This is a solidarity that is necessarily born out of comparison. So whether folks are calling for a ceasefire or demanding the total liberation of Palestine, many Puerto Ricans describe being called to action because Puerto Rico, like Palestine, faces a similar struggle against colonialism. So as you learned a bit in my introduction, I'm a social movement historian who has spent the last 10 years researching histories of Puerto Rican solidarities with Palestine. I began this work for many reasons, but one of the most important was a desire to write against the exceptionalism that so often characterizes how we talk about and how we produce scholarship about both Puerto Rico and Palestine. So what do I even mean by exceptionalism? Well, think, for example, of even the language we use for both. Puerto Rico's status question, the Palestine problem, which somehow renders both Puerto Rico and Palestine as uniquely complex, as detached from larger power structures, and as fundamentally unable to be solved. And what I found early on in this research is that there is actually a long and rich history of Puerto Rican radicals organizing in solidarity with Palestine and drawing comparisons between Puerto Rico and Palestine. So much like the Black and Palestinian left, this is a story of solidarity birthed in the aftermath of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and rooted in a broader politics of anti-imperialism and left internationalism. It is a story rooted in the militant politics of the most radical sectors of the Puerto Rican left, those committed to achieving Puerto Rican decolonization through any means necessary, including armed struggle. Much of this history of solidarity can be traced back to the Armed Forces of National Liberation, or FALN, which, as Margaret told us just before, was a clandestine organization largely based out of Chicago, though its members also stemmed from New York and the archipelago itself, committed to achieving Puerto Rican independence through armed struggle. Across their headline-grabbing and often controversial lifespan, the FALN launched over 100 attacks throughout the United States in an attempt to show the world that Puerto Rico is a colony. Among Puerto Rican and other New Left radicals who remained committed to a revolutionary politics, the FALN was a legitimate national liberation movement fighting for self-determination against an imperial power. They understood the fight against U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico as part of the global history of Third World liberation. And it was in this global struggle that the FALN believed Puerto Rico and Palestine as linked together, part and parcel of the same revolutionary struggle. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a bit from the book's working introduction to again address a question or concern that many, or maybe only a few of us, it's hard to tell, a question or concern that many in the room might be sharing right now, which is, again, should we even be comparing Puerto Rico and Palestine? So some might argue that comparing Puerto Rico and Palestine is disingenuous at best and irresponsible history and politics at worst. From this perspective, Puerto Ricans articulating anti-colonial solidarities with Palestine is merely an appropriation of Palestinian suffering. After all, and I'm going to be sarcastic these next few lines, after all, Puerto Rico is not exactly a militarily occupied nation like Palestine, although, of course, Puerto Rico has served as an important military base for the United States, not to mention the decades-long use of Vieques for bombing target practices by the U.S. Marines. Nor have Puerto Ricans been usurped by a settler population that continues to this day in confiscating homes, businesses, and lands in the name of establishing an ethnic majority state, as in the case of Israel, except that, once again, we could very well read, as many scholars have, the migratory patterns resulting from Operation Bootstrap's economic development plan as intentional forced migration meant to rid the island of surplus labor so as to allow the United States the illusion of showcasing Puerto Rico as a capitalist success. And, of course, many scholars and activists alike have also begun to explain the migration of American citizens to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria as, quote, speculating settlers combing the archipelago, end quote. Not to mention the very real traces of U.S. settler colonialism that did inform U.S. colonization over Puerto Rico, including the belief that Puerto Ricans were racial savages or conquered peoples in need of education on self-government. As one senior federal official remarked, quote, before the people of Puerto Rico can be fully entrusted with self-government, they must first learn the lesson of self-control and respect. They would inestimably fall or fail without a course under a strong and guiding hand, end quote. In other words, the purpose of comparison is not to suggest that Puerto Rico and Palestine are exactly alike. The demands of Puerto Rican citizens, even if on the archipelago second class, are different than the demands of stateless Palestinian refugees, Palestinians in the occupied territories, or for that matter, Palestinian citizens of Israel. But to not allow ourselves, whether in our activism or in our study of history, to compare Puerto Rico and Palestine on the grounds that they are not exactly the same would mean failing to discover the important and productive ways that Puerto Rican radicals in Chicago in particular, which is what the book will explore, try to radically make sense of and reimagine their world, much less how those reimaginings had very real implications, including how policymakers in the 1970s and 1980s linked the problem of international terrorism to the repression of radical social movements in the United States, including the Puerto Rican independence movement. So by seeing themselves as comrades in revolutionary struggle with Palestine, Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals helped write against the exceptionalism that continues to frame Puerto Rico's status question as both an unresolvable domestic political problem and as irrelevant to anti-colonial and anti-imperialist organizing today. Obtained as the spoils of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico has remained a colony, a U.S. colony since 1898, while Palestinian land has been increasingly incorporated into the Israeli state, whether by military aggression or illegal seizures for Israeli sentiments. Throughout these 76 years of Palestinian dispossession, and allow me to acknowledge here that today marks exactly 76 years since the Nakba, but throughout these 76 years, the United States and Israel have maintained an alliance based on, allegedly, shared values of democracy. But Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals would instead understand this alliance as one of imperial aggression. So whether as local coalition building in Chicago or the ideological inspiration for urban guerrilla warfare, transnational connections between Puerto Rico and Palestine were part of a broader, deliberate effort to link distinct local oppressions to the problem of colonialism. Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals identified with Palestinians because they, like Puerto Ricans, or like Palestinians, wait, I read that wrong, sorry. Back up. Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals identified with Palestinians because they, like Puerto Ricans, were an actively colonized people. And as a result, they uncovered very real material connections between the United States, Israel, and Puerto Rico. From the role of Zionist agricultural technologies. Can you hear her? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, gotcha. I'm wrapping up. So as a result, they uncovered very real material connections between the United States, Israel, and Puerto Rico, from the role of Zionist agricultural technologies on the island to, again, emerging counterterrorism policies that led to the hyper-policing and criminalization of both the Puerto Rican and Palestinian struggles as illegitimate political movements. So I'll end by saying that whether in our movement work or in these larger histories of solidarity we'll explore together this evening, I want to emphasize the importance and the utility of comparison for resisting these structures of exceptionalism. Again, the Palestine problem, Puerto Rico's status question. Structures that can lead people to believe that what is happening in Gaza is some anomaly. Happens to all of us. Instead, let us ground ourselves in that really great ringtone, but also in knowing and acknowledging that solidarity, that comparisons, that these are tools that can help us refuse to further isolate Palestinians or, for that matter, Puerto Ricans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Awartani, for talking to us about that historical solidarity between the two peoples, and also how the comparison is not only possible but necessary if we want to contribute to this liberation. And now, for our final panelist in this round of introductions, please welcome Alderwoman Velázquez. This distance should be fine.
Can you all hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to start this conversation. I'm not an academic. I did major in history and journalism, so I have an appreciation for it, but I'm going to tell you about me because I believe the personal is political. And there's a quote from Angela Davis, I believe, that sums it up. Everyone is familiar with the slogan, "The personal is political." Not only that we experience on a personal level, not only what we experience on a personal level has profound political implications, but that our interior lives, our emotional lives, are very much informed by ideology. We oftentimes do the work of the state in and through our interior lives. What we often assume belongs to our most intimately to ourselves and to our emotional life has been produced elsewhere and has been recruited to do the work of racism and repression. So before I thought about running as an elected, before I became an elected, I'm still a person, still a human. And I really believe in this conversation about colonization, for me, from my perspective, is that before we can decolonize any place, and as we decolonize places, we have to decolonize ourselves. Our bodies, our minds, our habits. Every day can be a moment for awakening. And just like Louise said, this is like a dream. This is like a dream to me. I never thought that there would be a moment where I would be standing here talking about my experience, about being a Diasporican, a Missouri-Kenya. And one of the things, we had a great conversation last night, and something that really rang true was colonialism and this idea that the political is personal. Colonialism causes contradictions and confusion, both inside and out. And you heard some of these contradictory sort of things. I think there's a great example of Puerto Ricans, they root for their baseball team, and they have a national baseball team, but they don't often question why they have a national baseball team if they're part of the U.S., right? So one thing I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the idea and the concept of a diaspora. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it mean to me? How does it show up? And I believe that is in this process, as we talk about self-determination and what that looks like in the political sense, it's also about self-discovery. And for me, this whole journey, it has been about that. So I want to tell you about mine. So I was born here. I was born in St. Louis. I was born in Chesterfield, actually, which likes to kind of freak people out when they ask the where are you from question. Where are you really from? And as this process of self-discovery, and I've had these moments of awakening. I mean, it first started with how did we get here? And it wasn't until probably 5 or 6 years ago that I learned about Operation Bootstrap, which, we can talk about it later, but was this process of, really this forced migration. I didn't know that had happened. My parents, growing up, I grew up in Baldwin, our story seemed exotic compared to the rest of our family, the families around me. But when I look at my life in the context of the island, it's not. My family left during that time. And so I've been thinking about, in these moments of awakening, there's this phrase in Spanish that's ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here, neither from there. And growing up as a Missourican, always felt not quite a Missourian, not quite a Puerto Rican. But it always gave me great empathy for others that were different, because I was always looking to find that one common piece of connection, because I never fit in really anywhere. So growing up in Baldwin, one day when I felt like I was the only person, I wrote an essay a few years ago, and I actually wrote it about my name, because again, all these struggles growing up, nobody ever knew how to spell my name, right? And growing up, literally up until probably I was 17, we were the only Velázquez in the phone book. True. And so I was like, well, I felt like we were the only ones. Were we really the only ones? And so I looked up the 1990 census record, and there were 24 Puerto Ricans in Baldwin, and my house had 6 of them. So we really kind of were the only ones. And so these are these moments where I was always kind of looking. I was always on this journey of self-discovery. And I think that is intimately related to colonization, right? Because when you're a part of a diaspora and you're disconnected from your culture, you're disconnected from your history, you don't know. I didn't know. I'm a product of public schools. There was no Puerto Rican history class. There was nothing more about, hey, they were part of this thing happened in 1898 and that was it, right? And so it was always like, why am I here? How did we get here? Why did this happen? And there are parts of me that felt really self-conscious about it. I'm lighter now in the summertime. I always joke that I'm ambiguously ethnic looking, although I am very Puerto Rican. Nobody kind of knew what I was. I knew what I was, but they didn't. So I always had questions, and there was always this sense of, almost shame, right? And so the first time I went to PR, I was 11, and my uncle, who I'd never met, had died. And so we went to near Aguadilla for the funeral, so in the country, right? And the funeral was in a house, and that was the first time I'd experienced, again, I grew up here in Missouri, so I didn't know that it's traditional to put a casket in a house. But that was it. And so again, on these journeys of who am I? What does this mean? It wasn't until high school that I took an art history class and I looked at a painting by the famous Renaissance painter Daniela Velázquez, and I was like, hey, he has an accent on his name. Is there an accent on my name? And when I think about it in the context of what we're talking about tonight, that is part of what people in a diaspora experience. I mean, and thinking about, and again, anecdotally, the connections between Palestine and Puerto Rico, Palestine and Puerto Rico and Haiti, anybody who's a part of a diaspora, it's culture, it's food, it's language, it can be, it doesn't have to be, and then it's also political. So I had this real, one of the shifts for me in my life is I decided in my 20s to go with my 2 aunts, and we went to the island. And my mom was upset that I didn't tell her, and then she called my great aunt and said, "Can you actually take your aunts across the country?" But I was really nervous because part of my growing up was, am I Puerto Rican enough? Right? I don't speak the language. I didn't grow up in Chicago. I was the only one. And so I got there, and my family embraced me. They loved me, and they said, you're always welcome here. You're always Puerto Rican, right? So I'm skipping around in my timeline here. But all these moments in my life have sort of built up to where I am now. So I'm the first Latina elected in the city of St. Louis. I'm what I believe, thank you. I believe I'm the only Puerto Rican elected official in the state of Missouri. I would love for somebody to prove me wrong, so there's another person out there. And one of the things that had happened, I'd had this very transformative time during the pandemic. We obviously, everybody was at home. It gave me some time to think. I took a bomba class from Chicago, bomba y plena. Not so great at that, but it was... I connected with people on Twitter. I asked somebody for a syllabus. That's how I learned about Operation Bootstrap. That's how I learned that at some point, I hope I get my history facts right, that, by the late 1970s, or that more than half the island had been sterilized. That's a whole other conversation, but that happened. I didn't know that. I didn't know my history. I didn't know that these things were happening and that there was this push. And then I went, part of my shame and part of my fear was that I didn't speak Spanish, and my parents, who both Spanish was their first language, chose not to. And so I went to Mexico City, was there for 5 months, was like, cool, peace out America, I'm gonna go global. And then my former alderperson asked me to run, and I was thinking about, if not me, then who? And we talked about representation, and if I don't do it, who else is gonna do it? And I think I can do this. But a question I had for me, and this is part of the dream, is that because I'd had these more expansive experiences for self-discovery, I didn't know how I would be able to help my people. And that was a pause I had before I decided to run, because if I stay in St. Louis, how am I going to do this? Is my world going to get smaller? And since then, it's grown. So I never thought that there would be a moment now, a year in, that I would be able to sit here with a bunch of Boricuas allies talking about these conversations. So I just want to thank you all for being here and, work on that we're going to decolonize ourselves together.
Thank you so much, Alderwoman Velázquez, for that testimony about your personal life as a Puerto Rican born in the diaspora. All right. We would like to then start round number 2. We have a couple of questions prepared, and then we will move on to questions from the audience. Okay. So, thank you so much, making sure those mics work. Well, are we ready? Perfect. Some historians suggest that one of the most serious problems that keep colonies is invisibility. And that applies, unfortunately, to the Palestinian problem. It applies to the Puerto Rican problem. As we have discussed, sometimes even Puerto Ricans themselves are not well aware, or people here in the States. And ultimately, one way of simplifying is colonies are extraction sites of material and human resources. And all of these resources are meant to strengthen an empire, trying to simplify. For each colony that is liberated, however, the empire's chain is weakened and the resistance of other colonies is strengthened. How do you, panelists, see the liberation of these two peoples, Palestine and Puerto Rico, connected? And why solidarity between them is important? I know that you have already mentioned some of these, but if you could provide some other examples, and also to answer this question about whether it's colonial or not, that would be great. How do you see the liberations connected, especially moving forward, and why solidarity between them is important? Please feel free to use one of the mics.
I'm happy to chat. Is this on? I just have to be like really close. I feel famous right now. I mean, I think I touched on this obviously in my remarks, but I will speak to kind of the same idea of shame. If you notice a slight southern accent, I'm born and raised in Gainesville, Florida, but am Puerto Rican. I also did not speak Spanish growing up. My parents, my mother's Puerto Rican, my father's Palestinian. They decided not to speak either language in our house. And so it was similarly not until I was in college that I took a class on Puerto Rico, and my world was changed, right? It suddenly made sense why my parents would choose to assimilate in the way that they did in the South. And what kind of burdens I was carrying because of those choices. So I chose, that was, I mentioned that there's many reasons I come to this work, but part of why I come to this work is a desire to find a different way to empower what I call historical identities that I couldn't get through being in community with folks, that I couldn't get by speaking the language and speaking with my relatives fluently, right? So I come to this work out of something really personal, but I do think it speaks to that bigger point that we were just thinking about kind of the impact of colonization on our daily lives, right? That we materially, without even knowing, are experiencing these things in the way our families make decisions, and then we have the capacity to then grow when we encounter new knowledge, right? Like I grew up not telling people I was Palestinian because I was ashamed to do so. And again, it wasn't until college that I then felt that I had a language and a capacity to talk about who I was in new ways. So this work is also very deeply personal at the same time that it sounds super professional and academic. But yes, the southern accent is from Gainesville. Go Gators.
Well, I mean, I'm going to expand on, I feel like we have a lot in common. And I think the connections of, a diaspora, right? I mean, so I think that part of the solidarity that, comes out in the work is part of that, I think, human need for understanding, right? And I think that especially when you're disconnected, and I'm a spiritual person, but I also believe that this whole experience is part of my dharma to really accept my ancestral roots, right? Like I have a mission from people who came before me that were from that island that said, you got to help. And so what does that mean? It means going back and learning and connecting. And I think that, I guess I felt like Margaret and Sara really described the history of the solidarity, but I think that, when we just look at the images of who is being targeted, they're people who look like me. They're people who look like us. And so I think that, as much as we can we are intellectualizing it, which is important, but there's also this very visceral connection of when we see the images of what's happening in Gaza, it could be Puerto Rico. It could be, and so I think that not only do we have a duty morally to fight and share solidarity, but we are connected.
Wait, that just made me think really quickly about, you told the story of your last name. My last name's Awartani. The first time, I'm assuming many of us in this room know about the Palestinian shot in Vermont, I think it was. That was the first time anybody recognized my last name, so that was, jarring, right? And made it, again, so much more personal that suddenly I'm like picking up my farm box in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and somebody's like, oh, Awartani, I now know what that name is, so, yeah.
I wanted to, wait, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to respond about the invisibilization and the impact. I think invisibilization, well, that's what I refer to it as, in any case, is not just about making people invisible. I think it's making people into a simple one-dimensional person. For example, Palestinians are not human beings of all different kinds. They're terrorists. That's all they are. So when you're killing them, you're killing children, you're not killing children, you're killing future terrorists. So therefore, I think the whole idea becomes of, if you put somebody into this little box and then you're able to dehumanize them, I think that allows for the kind of, in people's minds, obviously not our minds, but in some people's mind, this sense that, well, it's perfectly okay to do that. And I think this idea, I think is the history of imperialism, of turning human beings into something that they are not. And this is not exactly on the point, but I'm going to tell it anyway, because I'm from a small town in southwest Pennsylvania, which is something, my community, my county is 97% white. So I'm doing research on African Americans in my county, so I was just there, and I looked through the profile of my town, 440 pages listing every single, well, almost, listing tons of institutions, organizations, places of worship, businesses with people, pictures. According to the book from 1962, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, there was not a single black person in that town. They simply did not exist. And I think this is this whole other way of basically depriving people of humanity by depriving them of any right to existence. And I think that in supporting the liberation of Puerto Rico and supporting the liberation of Palestine, those of us like me who are neither Puerto Rican nor Palestinian, I think what we are trying to do is actually defeat an imperialist system. And I think it's an imperialist system that operates there, it operates here, it operates in Puerto Rico. And the ability to weaken one aspect of imperialism both gives us an understanding of how imperialism functions and also strengthens the ability of other nations to liberate themselves, nations and people, and there further weakens imperialism overall, which is why I think there is a holistic view towards this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Power. Moving on a little bit. So, speaking out. In the scale of crimes against humanity, there's probably no higher crime than genocide. For the past 7 months, we've been witnessing the most recorded live genocide in history, as far as we know, and many circles insist still to this day in remaining silent, hiding, give the same importance to the voices of privileged and oppressive groups than to voices of occupation and genocide as bombs fall over them. How can we move public discourse and individual actors to center the victims, speak out, and act with bravery in a sea of fear?
I'm happy to tackle this first again. Again, this is why I'm going to shift into like academic me. So I'm going to read again because I want to tell a story from the archive. So I say, let me share one story from the archive of Puerto Rican Solidarities with Palestine that speaks exactly to this question of whose voices do we center. So in 1983, former political prisoner Edwin Cortez was arrested for alleged involvement in the FALN and charged with seditious conspiracy. Yet throughout his years behind bars, he stayed abreast of political developments across Palestine. If this sounds very formal, it's because it's from a published piece. Yet throughout his years behind bars, for example, with the onset of the first Intifada, Cortez found himself compelled to write a defense of the Palestinian struggle. published in Libertad, which was the official journal of the campaign to free the Puerto Rican political prisoners. Cortés wrote, quote, "Within the past 2 months, renewed resistance in the Middle East has once again captured world attention. This time, it is not the tragic Iran-Iraq war, but Palestine, a nation in struggle that represents a vital threat to the existence of Zionism, Arab reaction, and U.S. imperialism in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip," end quote. Here is the point I really want to emphasize. Cortés warned Libertad's readers to refuse the U.S. and Israeli media's attempts to cast the uprisings as temporary civil unrest caused by outside agitators. And so this will feel familiar to us, right? And he writes, "Nothing could be further from the truth. Rather, these, quote, massive acts of resistance by a wide spectrum of Palestinians are led by genuine and experienced indigenous leadership." So in the letter, Cortés is calling Libertad's readers to really listen, center, and trust Palestinian voices in their movement work. Quote, "The task of progressive and freedom-loving people, national liberation movements, and socialist countries is to concretely and materially support the Palestinian people's uprising, the right to self-determination, and the establishment of a Palestinian state." So again, an example of how we too must listen, center, and trust Palestinian voices in our movement work. And academic me.
I love academic you.
I sound really smart that way.
You know, I think so. Before I, long ago, not that long ago, but long ago enough, I started my career as a journalist, and so I do believe, you know, in the power of storytelling, and sitting with historians. You know, history is often, the narrative is often controlled by the victor, right? So, I think one, sharing stories, speaking, sharing, speaking out. I've been very inspired by the young people. I'm not as young as maybe I look. But with the bravery and ferocity and courage of speaking truth to power, and I think forcing some conversations that haven't happened, I think is important. As well as I would say that, you know, in the broader sense too, there's the sort of acute, we have to tell these stories and tell them now. And just from the elected perspective, it's also important to have both people who look like us and people who understand us in those seats of power to help tell those stories and uplift those stories. And obviously I'm not going to try and get too political, but one of the, I think, the Representative Cori Bush has done a great job of helping centering the voices of those most affected. And she's done that through allyship. I mean, with Representative Tlaib, you know, with Representative Ayanna Presley, you know, I mean, there is a solidarity and allyship, but also a recognition that if we work together to center those voices, it can really not only make a difference, it's the important work that has to be done.
In terms of getting courage, I think that's a real tough one because probably, I'm assuming some of us or all of us have participated in demonstrations at different points throughout our lives. And it is scary when these almost always bigger police guys come charging at you. That is scary. And I think what allows people to continue to resist is the sense of it's not just me. I'm part of a collective organization. I'm part of a collective group. We're doing this together. It doesn't overcome it, but it helps a lot. And I think that what's really struck me is I don't think I've seen this kind of solidarity, I don't think since the 1980s or the Vietnam War, which means talking about 30 years, something like that. And I think that's pretty remarkable. And I've heard different interviews with a lot of the different, I'm talking about students right now, the students who are in the encampments. And what struck me so much is how clear they are, how articulate are. They know exactly why they're there. And I just because it was the most recent one, I don't know how many people saw the 6-minute interview with the University of Chicago student saying, I don't care about my career. I don't care. Nothing matters to me but saving the lives of people in Palestine. And that it's been viewed I don't know how many times. And I say, this is such an important lesson for people to realize that there is a real alternative. You don't need to care about these things when we're talking about genocide.
Thank you so much. There's something worth giving it all. There's something worth offering everything I have. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to respect the time of the audience to ask their questions, so I would only ask one more for now. And let's talk about a solution, the $1 million question. Of course, two historians, one elected official. We do not expect you to lay out a plan point by point.
Oh, I actually have one.
Okay, great. So what is your view for a potential solution, both to, for example, the current conflict in Palestine and the colonialism in Puerto Rico as well? Some historians, for example, say, well, something that could be done is what happened in South Africa. The ANC comes to power, Mandela becomes president, and apartheid, the process of demolishing apartheid begins, and a campaign of national reconciliation starts. So some people say that, but then some people say, well, that would be a problem because of the land claims, etc. So what do you think would be a viable solution, in your opinion, for both Puerto Rico and Palestine, taking into consideration similarities and differences?
This is a big question. I'm going to go first so that I can be the first to say it, which is that I'm a historian and therefore I do not think about policy solutions. But I would say that, like, when I need hope, I would turn to the South African example as something that, like, God, please, I hope we can move in that direction, right? And then I think we were having conversations earlier, particularly thinking about Puerto Rico, that I think about conversations about, for example, gentrification and how do we center a community in the way we develop, and that helps me think about how we might think about Puerto Rican decolonization. Or I think in both cases, I think the conversations we've had in the past few years about abolition and forward steps and freedom dreaming and the idea of dreaming, right, and really thinking about new futures is what I rest with and is what I maybe offer my students when we're talking and they're going to go into the world and offer policy solutions that I won't. But those are the kinds of questions that I pose for them, like how do you move forward in the world then with what we're learning, both in community with one another, but in these kind of larger scales of community building. So that's my cop-out.
Well, I'm also going to caveat that I'm not a foreign policy expert. But I think just, anecdotally, right? I do think that the South African framework makes sense. I think that part of what is really important just being in the U.S. is the idea of reconciliation, right? That has to happen because we've seen, we live in a society where it hasn't happened, and I do believe that the enslavement of people is the U.S. is one of the U.S.'s original sins. I guess there are a few. And so the idea that that has to be acknowledged, I think, is incredibly important. And I think also for Puerto Rico, I think there is also this recognition and reconciliation of what a neo-colony is and what it has been. And so, there are tough questions. So yes, that's my answer.
I guess I'm a bit of a dissenting voice here. I do not think South Africa is a model because I think white people still control South Africa by and large, although there is still there's greater power by the African people themselves. But if you look at the economic wealth, and the land, it's still concentrated in the hands of white people in South Africa. So although you might have so-called reconciliation, that doesn't mean anything if you don't have real power in the hands of a real power shift. And that's what I think has to happen. There has to be a real shift in power. I'm one of those, you know, I guess I might be a teeny bit older than some people here, so I'm more supporting like a democratic secular state. I do not believe a two-state solution is possible. I'll just say that. I don't think that the only way it could possibly be possible is if you destroy the economic power, military might, and economic domination of Israel. Otherwise, Palestine will remain a dominated state, whatever it is. You can't have it. I think we have to think of the real world. And I think the same with Puerto Rico. I think Puerto Rico has different solutions too, but I think part of Puerto Ricans, I support independence for Puerto Rico. I think that you have to think a little more creatively of what independence means in 2024, 2025, whatever it is. And I think for me, what independence means is sort of I see the germs of it, not germs. What's the? Gems. No, seeds. Not germs of it. Say after Hurricane Maria, where people began saying, okay, we want to, in order to have self-determination, in order to have independence, we have to have an economy that's under our control. So you begin to have people in Puerto Rico saying, we don't want to rely on imports. We're going to start developing our own food, and we're going to develop solar energy. We're going to develop an agricultural system that can sustain us. And then I think you have to think of Puerto Rican independence also in terms of a broader issue of sort of who are the allies in the area that you can work with, that you can build kind of not just sort of nation states versus nation states, but different real solid alliances with other people. That to me makes something a little more potential.
Thank you so much, Dr.
God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Awartani. Okay, well, now I would like to open up the mic for the audience. Just a couple of, the mic is right here in the middle of the hallway. Just a reminder, please let us be considerate also of other people that want to ask questions. Do not take a lot of time establishing a long context. Please go as soon as possible to your question. And then if I see that you are taking very long and that you're taking us, from here to there, I will unfortunately have to stop you. Okay? Okay. All right. Anyone would like to start us off with a question? Please, would you? Oh, yeah, or they can be brought forward. Whatever works.
I don't think so because it's taped, yeah.
Oh.
I can give it here.
Okay, you can use this.
To keep this short, I want to say thank you so much. One thing, I didn't know a lot about Puerto Rico before I came here. Had no idea about any of this, so I really appreciate it. But my question is, as we're having conversations with people, and this can be such a charged issue, how do you all advise having these difficult conversations with people that don't share similar beliefs?
That's a great question. I'm not a conflict mediation expert. Certainly in my day job, there are always, it's hard. It can be hard, right? It is hard. And, I think we even had a little bit of a, heated conversation, even, last night among friends, even though we I think agree on 90% of things. And I would say that finding the places, I know it sounds cliche, but meeting people where they are and finding the places that you have in common first. And I think this is an interesting conversation when we talk about at least the Puerto Rican diaspora, right? If I may say so, we were having it last night, right? Because there's been some work on a coalition level, some things about food, we call food sovereignty, but about we're trying to make sure that the island imports 85% of its food, and some other sort of policy issues. And in this coalition, we've been talking about a couple issues that we agree on, but when you talk about some of the bigger questions like the status question, you don't agree on. So, my general sense would be if there's a nugget of, place, if there's a nugget where you can have a discourse, or you can find some common ground. And I want to shout out one of my constituents / friends over in the corner, Dan, who I would just say has a conflict mediation background. I think that'd be fair to say. But I mean, one of the things that he's taught me is, always trying to be curious, even when you're heated, right? So asking questions, and sometimes it's better to ask questions, one, to let people talk, not just to, you should listen too, right? But sometimes the emotion and feeling is because people really want to say something, and oftentimes people cut them off before they can say something. So by being genuinely curious and asking questions and trying to figure out how they may have got there, I think it allows an opening for conversation when it's hard. But it is hard, and sometimes you need to take a couple deep breaths and, try again another day.
I just think I don't have anything to add to what you said.
I mean, I'll just say that I think most of these interactions for me come in the classroom, right, when I'm working with my students in a variety of topics, right? I teach in the Department of American Culture, I teach Latino Studies, so this framing is useful in a handful of situations. But I often ask my students, again, that question of who do we hold at our center? So I try and keep that kind of language with me when I'm teaching, when I'm interacting with other folks, right, that a story can change and the way we understand history can change when a different set of voices are at the center, both even just like how the state understands a movement versus how a movement actor understands a movement, right? Like it has a variety of applications. So I think about that. And then I also just think that like everybody's on a journey and that folks have the capacity to grow. I think, again, that's easy to explain in the classroom when students are walking in as freshmen and they don't know things, and you can model that for them. But keeping that in my heart keeps me from like becoming hardened, I think, which makes the work difficult.
Thanks so much. Anyone else?
Okay. In my, albeit very limited experience, one of the things I've noted, having lived in Puerto Rico as well, is that a lot of the movements and the resistance that you guys were talking about, even the armed struggle, a lot of that came about from the Diáspora. And speaking with Puerto Ricans living on the island, there is a certain, let's call it domestication, particularly like the PNP and whatnot, that they have kind of accepted the reality of the situation that they live in. Not that it's correct. But do you guys see a similar kind of movement or idea arising in Palestine? And could there even potentially be a similar sort of resolution where you just accept colonization? Not that we should, to be clear, but it's just something that I think talking to a lot of people on the island, they express kind of the frustration and the difficulty of kind of always living that struggle.
That's a really hard question. I mean, I think I would say that, again, if we're talking about how, okay, I'll say two things. I think, one, the degree of violence is obviously so much more extreme in Palestine. Not close enough. So, that comparison then gets hard and complicated. And then I think that also Palestine feels different for somebody from the diaspora versus somebody from Gaza versus somebody in, a Palestinian refugee. I'm thinking diaspora as in the United States, a Palestinian refugee, a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And all of those folks have different relationships to how we understand Palestine, both in memory and in reality, and also how we encounter Israel as a state. So that's not an answer, but it's to say that, like, again, I think that somebody who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel and has to negotiate that power in a different way would be very different than somebody experiencing the extreme violence right now in Gaza, right? And we have to account for that. So that's a non-answer for me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is on? Yes. Okay. Okay. I just think Palestinians will never give up. I don't think Israel can defeat Palestinians, and I just think they will continue to resist. I mean, to me, what's amazing I keep looking at Palestinians, and I just find it's so amazing that they continue to struggle and they continue to resist. I don't want to essentialize them and people, or those people at all, but any people, but I just think that they will continue. And I think that in that sense, to me, Palestinians are an example for the entire world.
I'm gonna sort of flip that question in reverse. I think just quick. Well, no, I'm just gonna. I know you asked about the Palestinian diaspora, and I just want to, I think, talk a little bit about the Puerto Rican diaspora, right? Because I think this is a conversation that I've been having lately, and as much as it can parallel, because it is different. I think for all of us diasporicans and allies of the diasporicans, I do think that there is both actually an awakening happening, right? I'm glad you said what you said, Margaret, about this hearkening to to the Vietnam era. There is, I think that it's complicated, right? But I think that there are crises happening on the island that maybe weren't happening 10, 15 years ago, and they're becoming more acute. And I also think that there is, just like the same youth movement or young people movement that's happening here is happening there, and I think it's pushing awareness. And I do think, at least, and I'm going to speak for me and me as a Puerto Rican person in the diaspora, I do think there is this both awakening and sort of responsibility, right, to talk about it, to connect with the island, and also to help awaken ourselves, right? And I think that goes back to the, that we've all been, at least I've been, the colonization that happens. And I think what, there's almost this piece where there's fear, right? There's fear of the unknown. What could independence look like? What does it look like? We know what this looks like, and it's almost comfortable enough to not push people out. Right? So, and this is why the deepening crises, the deepening, rents, the average rent since Hurricane Maria has gone up almost 600% on the island. I mentioned the island imports 85% of this food. There are more climate crises, and I'm not saying that I want more things to happen, but the crisis is deepening, right? So that is going to push some people into more discomfort, which I think is going to have more action. And I also think by the nature of a diaspora and us being connected, we are going to feel that, but also we are being pushed and inspired by younger people too, right? And I think that will create some movement.
Wait, I just want to add really quickly. This made me think, I wonder if in Puerto Rico we also struggle with this, alleged promise of assimilation. There's kind of this project that we're supposed to assimilate into the United States, but in the case of Palestine, the project is elimination, right? Yeah. So that is a very different condition in which people organize, think of futures, et cetera.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Next question, please.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for all of your brilliance. This has been great. My question is for Alderwoman Velázquez. Would you support and introduce policies that seek to divest St. Louis' role in the genocide?
That's a great question, and I would. I think that that's the part where we have to take action, and we have to look at where we control, what our sphere of influence is, and certainly, that's something that I don't know that we've looked at the city yet.
I guess it's me now. Okay, so I have a very different question. So I'm looking at the encampments and all of this energy going on on college campuses, and what I see is a kind of organizing that is much deeper and than what has been going on for the last at least 15, 20 years, which has been signing petitions and, calling and registering a complaint with your senator or representative or someone, your local government or your state government. And it takes me back to both organizing around the Vietnam War and organizing around especially Central America, organizing in the 80s. And that was very deep organizing. It wasn't, yes, we, as someone who is part of that. So, and I think that what is now missed is this, it's very shallow. So someone can sign a petition and think they've done a great thing. And so I'm going to ask you for your take on what kind of organizing needs to be done around both Palestine and Puerto Rico, but more generally to pressure the U.S. to change. I mean, that's, yeah.
Would you like to? You can go first. Anybody wants to? I don't know if this is going to answer this question, but I will say that I am impressed. I think University of Michigan's maybe on their 23rd day of an encampment. We went through graduation. We're still there. I am impressed, I think, by the commitment of students to history, and I'm a historian, so of course, but I think that there's really a deep commitment among students to understand past histories of student movements, but I think that they're really cognizant of the turnover happening always on a college campus and trying to institutionalize their knowledge, right? So my answer, or at least how I'm approaching this in my longevity at the university, is to teach courses in student movement histories where with the student activists on campus, we are going to build repositories of that organizing work and train them to think about, I have an idea of an assignment that will be write about a movement happening on campus right now with the same dignity that these historians are writing about past movements, right? Because I think that they're recognizing this disconnect between how the university is going to recognize a protest from the Vietnam era versus, what they actually did. So I think about the utility of history, right? And we have all these anti-critical race theory mumbo jumbo that's happening everywhere. And really the importance of history education, right? The humanities. I think that that's intimately tied to the movement organizing we do. So that's my push for, history as being really vital to the way we build community, that it's not just the university as factory and producing STEM majors and all these things, that we really have to revalue, what this intellectual work does for us, especially, again, when I think about the students and what tools they need, so.
That is a great question. And I mean, I'm just going to sort of answer it anecdotally. I mean, I think, again, I feel like I am all in my fields, but I think that is, part of the emotional connection, and Margaret, you had it in your definition that I had to get from you. But the emotional social connection, right? And so, one way, and how you scale it, we can talk about it. Obviously, I know where you live. she's a constituent, okay? I'm not trying to be creepy. And a friend. So for me, part of this connection, I'm going to use me as an example, has been connecting with the Chicago Puerto Ricans who kind of have adopted me, and it was a serendipitous, wonderful story that I can tell you about. They love you. But also that emotional connection to my people, and also I had the opportunity to go back to the island with some of the folks from Chicago in December, and so for me, putting the context of these conversations in a visceral way, I could see, to me, sort of the fading of some of the culture, right, and some of the traditions, and just, the island is getting older, and so you can see these, the effects, I think, of colonization, what happens when people are pushed out when you go there. And so it had an impact on me, and I you know, as I was riding around in this van, which if you go on the island, do not pick the back seat if you get car sick. If you're on the island. But the experience, I was like, you need to have like trips from people from the diaspora to here, so they can, even if they've never been here, or if like I've been there but in different circumstances, and we visited governments, we visited nonprofits, and I had, you know, I was with Jose, so every moment he stopped to tell me a history story, I listened, but it just created a different experience, right? So I think part of the organizing is almost creating these experiences where people can really deeply connect, and so it becomes, it goes beyond an idea, it becomes part of them, if that makes sense.
I totally agree with what you were saying. I'll be really brief. I think, to me, what we really need to do is go beyond the communities in which we already are, either our friends and sometimes family that support us, or our political circles, or the campuses. I think we need to actually go into communities and talk to people directly, even going door to door. I think that for many people, you know, often think, wow, everybody on a campus is in a student encampment, or these you take over Golden Gate, everybody agrees. But the realities, I would say probably often 50, 60, 70% of people don't even know what's going on. I mean, to me, the level of passivity, ignorance, indifference is really not great. But I think one way to do it is going up, and I totally agreed with what you said earlier, actually talking to people, especially listening to people, seeing what they have to say. And that's harder, and it's not really fun necessarily. But actually, don't go alone ever, but I think it's important to do. No, you can stay. Come back. Yeah.
If you are planning to make a question, I think we could take maybe one more. So make your way to the line.
No, we'll be brief. We'll be brief.
We don't have to do closing remarks.
Yeah, skip our closing. We don't have closing remarks. We said it all.
Yeah.
Skip our closing remarks.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so my question before I ask my question, I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to our physical location and the history of that, being in this former Presbyterian church, which was the center of that former African-American community of Mill Creek. And there are so many parallels in that in the African-American history of the displacement, that the treatment, the violence, and everything that between African-American community in Puerto Rico and Palestine. And given that, what do you think we can do to raise awareness that even today that we're all one and the same, and that we still have these problems that exist among all of us basically brown people?
I hate that I keep going first. I mean, I will again. Take it away, Sarah. I will say, you know, again, I didn't expect to become a social movement historian, but like being a social movement historian in this moment, especially, is so grounding, right? And I really think even just reading and studying histories of solidarity is reassuring to me. I don't have my email address up, but if I did, you could email me anytime. Ask for my email. I can send you books. You know, I think that, especially thinking about our local histories, again, I think about that a lot more now that I'm teaching on a campus where things are happening so profoundly, that is a grounding experience and helps you think about the way you relate to other folks, right? And just what it means to be in community with each other in those ways, especially once we have that kind of grounding. So again, history.
Well, and I'll just jump in here too. And I mean, I look at this room, right? And this room looks like, I mean, it's diverse. I mean, and I think that, you know, part of for those of us who see the threads, to continue connecting the threads for other people. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought that up, Brandon. And I think too, I mean, talking about, you know, the stories, and I think for us, I'll just give an example. So I grew up here in St. Louis. My partner he was born in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. and he moved, he grew up in the Delta until he was 13 and then moved to Minnesota. That's a whole other conversation. But, you know, the fact when you talk about displacement, I mean, if you look at the town of Mount Bayou now, it was one of the, you know, was one of the first African-American, you know, successful cities in the Delta, and it's a shell of what it once was, which is why his family moved. And so, you know, he and I have talked a lot about it because there are certainly parallels from what he experienced and what his family experienced in the Delta, and even the idea of, you know, I know I'm a lot in my feels tonight, but I think that there's shared joy, but I think that there's also this shared, like, grief and sadness that comes with displacement, right? And then also, like, helping connect that for other people. Like, I didn't grow up in the Delta, but certainly I can go back and look at PR and see these towns and see, you know, the disinvestment and what happens when people are forced to leave. And, you know, there's other things that are built and on top of that land, right? And so I think for all of us to just keep having those conversations and to not forget is really important.
But that's Missouri too.
Yeah.
In Missouri, these towns are being held behind. I mean, and these are the kinds of connections we need to make.
I just want to quickly say, I keep talking about history, but I mean history as storytelling, right? Like, I come, you know, there's history, formal history, that's like state archives. I am trained in the tradition of Latino studies, ethnic studies, where history is storytelling, right? Where it is actually from the bottom up. So storytelling as history, and like really thinking of ourselves as historians, as storytellers.
Okay, next question, please.
Move this down a little bit. Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, making sure. So my question is about how, I was thinking when you guys were talking earlier about how in America, like, we're in the imperial core, as I would think of it, and there's a lot of ways that I'm seeing people organize and do various things. As somebody who's new to organizing and new to organizing language, I'm curious what kind of, like, maybe your top action that you can see us doing in the imperial core to dismantle, like, the machine that we're in, you know, because I think that's our responsibility and our moral duty as part of the imperial core, people who benefit from imperialism and extractive practices. Like, how do we organize effectively where we are standing in the piece of the puzzle?
So I'm going to take it from, I was a journalist before, and then I joked that I was a PR, but I did public relations before I ran for office. And I think about, and this might be a different answer, I mean, I think about things in terms of, audience, right? Mm-hmm. Who are you trying to reach, and meeting them where they're at? And so, you know, and it's been, I won't say a struggle, but it's always a constant thing for me being an elected now, and figuring out not just the right language to use, but using, I would say, simple language, but language that is accessible for people, right? Because I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up, you know, we assume that people might know as much as we do about these issues, and chances are they don't, right? So when thinking about how do you make, you know, and that's why stories are so great, and personal stories are so great, because, you know, you connect person to person, but figuring out a way to say, to share that in, I don't want to say simple, but really accessible, right? Like, that anybody who doesn't know anything about Puerto Rico or Palestine, or even what imperialism is, that, you know, they might understand what oppression feels like. They might understand what displacement feels like. They might, you know, like, shout to Brandon, but like, they might, you know, again, the story of this place, which I didn't know until, you know, a couple minutes ago. They might see that, or they might come from a community that this wasn't their church and they didn't experience that, but they had a church on their block that was just like that, right? And so I think thinking about who you're trying to reach, and a college campus, I think is different. Yeah. And that's okay, right? But it again is, who are you trying to reach, and how do they need to be reached? How do they need to be talked to understand? Not how I think I should talk to them or what I think they should think, right? But how are they going to digest it? Because ultimately, if I want to, you know, help them understand or, you know, shift their perspective, I have to do it in a way that that they can receive it.
Okay, last question. Thank you so much to everyone.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I think you made a wonderful point earlier about the importance of raising Palestinian voices, especially thinking about Palestinian journalists. I've seen a lot of like mainstream media kind of talking about their inability to report because of a lack of reporters on the ground. So I was wondering, especially Alderman Velázquez, with your background in journalism, if you could speak to that, and also kind of the invocation of like saying like the Hamas-run health industry when talking about death counts to sort of discredit the voices that they aren't ignoring completely.
I mean, that's a great question too. I mean, I mean, it's complicated, right? I mean, I think what has been so amazing to see, like, so my degrees, and one of my degrees is in journalism, and it's in news editorial and newspapers, and that's what I studied. And that doesn't exist anymore, right? And the idea of a citizen journalist when I was in college was sort of this conceptual thing, right? And that's what it is now. I mean, there's some organizations that are like, you know, Al Jazeera that are media organizations that are not citizen journalists that are doing a good job. But I think sharing those stories, I mean, a lot of times I get my news, you know, I mean, it's so decentralized, news consumption these days, that, you know, the mainstream organizations, while they have reach, they don't necessarily have the same reach they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, which is both, you know, frustrating and opportunity, right? It's frustrating with, one, the amount of disinformation, and we've seen that, and the deep fake state and all of that. But it also lends an opportunity for groups and people to uplift the voices of people who are experiencing it, and you don't need to know how to use an Oxford comma. We had that conversation earlier. You don't need to know the what is professional to be able to tell a story. So I think continuing to be critical, I think it's important for people to be critical of their news sources in general, because there is so much disinformation out there. But I also think that, you know, sharing the stories from the people who are on the ground and who are really from those communities, and, you know, as a J School alum, I mean, that's something I think the field has always struggled with, right? We talk about it from this supposed unbiased state, but we're all biased, right? So, I mean, it's so important to have people who understand the cultural context of what is happening, which usually happens when it's people covering their own people, right? Or people. So that I think is one part. And I think two, having conversations, you know, about what you see and what you hear. And I think having those hard dinner table conversations too, I think is important. Did I answer all your question? I feel like I left out a part.
No, but I wanted to say something totally different. Okay. I brought my books to sell. The proceeds from the book, well, I'm going to keep a teeny bit for myself, are going to Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora. I do not want to take any single one of those books back to Chicago because they're a pain in the butt to carry. So if you cannot afford the price that is being offered, we can sell them for less. I'm making a unilateral decision because I don't want to carry them.
Oh.
Okay, never mind. We are. I still don't want to carry. I don't want to carry 3 back. I don't want any. Okay.
To our organization, we are a non-profit, C4, so, you know, thank you for your support.
Thank you so much. Just to close us off, I would like to invite panelists, if they wish, to please give us some closing remarks based on our conversation. Each of you have 3 minutes, and then Luis will tell us about our next event. We have a fundraiser right in front of the street in Salsa Rosada. So again, last remarks by our panelists, and Luis will close us off.
I will go first because I have a closing remark that I've been doing for previous teach-ins. So again, I'm going to read. So I say, as a movement historian of the ethnic and Latinx studies traditions, it would be uncharacteristic of me to conclude our time without affirming the importance of endurance to movement work. So allow me to end then with the words of Palestinian-American writer and poet Hala Alyan. She reminds us that, quote, "We belong to long, gorgeous lineages of endurance. We are all here because someone, somewhere endured. When it feels impossible, find land, find breath, find each other, find songs and poems of endurance. Seek out the journalists, the healers, the historians. This feeling of despair, of rage, of unreality is what helps us seek and preserve truth. This feeling doesn't have to be turned into anything other than what is to be endured."
Well, I don't have official closing remarks. That was beautiful, though. I felt like we should have just ended there. I mean, first I want to say thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming here with curiosity and open minds, and I believe open hearts. I think that, you know, we both have to lead and listen, and that's part of doing this work. And so I think just, you know, keep on asking questions, keep on trying to build community, and I think that's the way we move forward.
I just really want to thank the organizers, Angel, Luis, and Daniela. No, you're definitely an organizer, and I really think it's great that we are together. And I'd say, okay, my favorite expression in Spanish is "no hay mal que por bien no venga," which sort of is like every cloud has a silver lining, although not quite. But I mean, the thing is, we wouldn't be here. And the fact that we're here means that we have to, I think, keep staying together and keep fighting until we get what we want.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Power. Thank you also to all of our sponsoring organizations and organizations that endorse this event: Occupy SLU, AMP Missouri, Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the PSL, the STL-PSC, Tower Grove for Palestine, WSM, Projo, STL, CLN, among many others. Thank you so much. Without your endorsement and calling all of your constituencies here, this would be very hard to do, this dialogue. Yes?
Can we do a special shout out to SLU?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much.
I mean, thank you. Well,
thank you, St. Louis University, for allowing us to use this university space for what a university is supposed to do. Provide spaces for hard conversations, hard dialogues, even when it is inconvenient for the institutions.
And the cookies.
And thank you for the cookies. They were especially great.
I think everybody should feel free to take them because we don't want the food to go to waste.
Yes. Before I forget, Luis, can you tell us what's going to happen immediately after this?
Yes. All right, another round of applause for our panelists, for Angel, for SLU, for the IFCLA colleagues in front that have been manning that table, or being at that table, staffing that table. Remind them there's still only 3 copies left, so see me if you want to buy one. All proceeds will go to support our work. And if you guys want to keep having this conversation, plus with Puerto Rican food, plus with some spirituous drinks, please come and join us. Walking distance. Salsa Rosada, just basically across the street. We're going to be there just after this. We're going to spend there a few hours, continue to build community, continue to talk, continue to meet folks. And of course a fundraise so that both PR can continue to do this work across the United States and in Puerto Rico. I think we're trying to organize folks. That's what both PR is. We want to talk about Puerto Rico. We want to talk about Palestine everywhere, anywhere. It doesn't matter, right? I think already time that we just stop using other words to explain what is really going on. This is colonialism, and we have to fight colonialism in Puerto Rico, in Palestine, and everywhere. So please join us. Nobody's going to be turned around at the door. Everybody's welcome. And I just expect to see all of you there. Let's have some cheering moments, and let's continue the struggle. Thank you. Thank you. Daniela.
Do you want to explain what it means?
Hangueo, yeah, hangueo. So hangueo is an Anglicism, right? It's basically like Spanglish, right? Like to hang out. So we Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico go, vamos a hanguear, vamos a hangueo. So that's it. They say hang out for a cause. It's a hangout for us to continue doing our work and for organizing or for bringing people together. So thank you, Sul, thank you, Rita, thank you, Angel. And see you guys in a bit at Salsa Rosada. Vamos por ahí. Oh, yes, yes. Please, there's a QR code for feedback. Our great friends at IFTA put this together, so we will really appreciate your feedback on this event. Thank you so much. We'll be meeting you here for a little bit before moving to Salsa Rosada. Thank you.
That was good. Really?
No.